June 17th, 1944, Château de la Roche-Guyon, Normandy. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel stood at the tall windows of the chateau that served as his Army Group B headquarters and watched the sky. He had been watching the sky constantly since returning from Germany on June 6th, the day everything changed. Above the Seine Valley, a formation of American heavy bombers droned eastward at high altitude, their contrails cutting white lines across the summer blue. There were no German fighters anywhere in sight. There had not been German fighters in meaningful numbers since the invasion began. Admiral Friedrich Rüge, Rommel's naval advisor, stood beside him that morning and recorded in his diary what the Field Marshal said. The war could not be won with an enemy who controlled the air so completely. Every road, every crossroads, every column of vehicles moving in daylight belonged to the Americans and the British. Rommel had spent 3 years building the Atlantic Wall, had driven his engineers and his infantry to exhaustion, laying mines and pouring concrete, and in a single day the Allies had broken through it as though it were made of paper. What Rommel did not yet fully grasp was that the sheer weight of American military power he was witnessing overhead would do more than destroy his army in the field. It would destroy something far more dangerous to Adolf Hitler. It would destroy Rommel's loyalty. Within 30 days of this moment, the most famous general in Germany would be connected to a conspiracy to remove the Führer, and within 4 months he would be dead by his own hand, forced to swallow cyanide in exchange for a promise that his family would be spared. The machine that broke him was not a single weapon or a single battle. It was the totality of American industrial and military power, laid out across the skies and beaches of Normandy in a display so overwhelming that it convinced Rommel and the officers closest to him that the war was not just being lost, it had already been lost. And that conviction would set in motion the most dramatic internal crisis the Third Reich ever faced. Rommel had arrived in France in late 1943 with a mandate to make the Atlantic coast impregnable. He brought to the task the same furious energy that had made him legendary in North Africa. He personally inspected hundreds of miles of coastline, travelling in his staff car from the Netherlands to Brittany, stopping at bunkers and gun positions, berating officers whose preparations he found inadequate, ordering improvements on the spot. He demanded the laying of over 6 million mines along the invasion beaches. He ordered beach obstacles, steel crosses and stakes designed to rip the bottoms out of landing craft, positioned at the tide lines where they would do maximum damage. He demanded concrete bunkers with interlocking fields of fire, flooded fields behind the coast to drown paratroopers, and stakes driven into every open meadow where gliders might land. He called these preparations his Devil's Garden, and he believed that if the invasion could be defeated in its first hours on the beach, the war in the West could be prolonged indefinitely. His chief of staff, General-Lieutenant Hans Speidel, later wrote that Rommel worked with an almost manic intensity, as though the invasion were arriving the next morning. Speidel, a cultured intellectual with a doctorate in history who was more comfortable in a seminar room than a command bunker, had been assigned to Rommel in April of 1944, and from the beginning he observed his commander with a mixture of professional admiration and quiet concern. Speidel had his own connections. Before arriving at La Roche-Guyon, he had already been in contact with members of the German resistance through his longtime associate Karl Heinrich von Stülpnagel, the military governor of occupied France. Speidel would later claim that he never explicitly revealed these connections to Rommel, but he did not need to. The situation in Normandy would make the argument for him. The scale of what the Allies unleashed on June 6, 1944, defied every calculation the German command had made. Rommel himself was in Germany that day, visiting his wife Lucy for her birthday, convinced by weather reports that no invasion could come in the current conditions. The first reports reached him by telephone. They were fragmentary and confused, as first reports always are, but even the fragments were staggering. Allied naval forces had assembled the largest armada in human history, more than 5,000 ships. Nearly 11,000 aircraft flew missions on that single day. Along a front of roughly 50 miles, over 150,000 troops came ashore in the first 24 hours. German defenders along the coast, many of them second-rate divisions composed of older men, foreign conscripts, and soldiers recovering from wounds sustained on the Eastern Front, faced a bombardment from sea and air that survivors described as beyond anything they had imagined warfare could produce. The naval gunfire alone was devastating. American battleships, including the Texas and the Arkansas, fired their 14-inch guns directly into the bluffs above the beaches. Each shell weighed over 1,400 pounds. Cruisers and destroyers added their fire from closer range, some moving so near to shore that they risked running aground, pouring shells into German positions with a precision that reflected months of preparation and target study. German bunkers that had been designed to withstand conventional artillery were simply erased. The fortifications that Rommel had inspected with such confidence that he had personally verified as capable of stopping an invasion were shattered by a weight of naval ordnance that no coastal defense in history had been designed to endure. Soldiers in the coastal strongpoints who survived the bombardment described the experience in terms that recurred across dozens of post-war accounts. The ground shook without stopping, concrete cracked and split. Men bled from their ears. Sand and debris filled the embrasures faster than it could be cleared. Communications lines were severed in the first minutes. Many defenders spent the crucial early hours unable to contact their own headquarters, unable to call for reinforcements, unable even to determine the full scope of what was happening. Fighting in isolation while the largest invasion force ever assembled poured onto the beaches below them. Rommel rushed back to France and reached his headquarters on the evening of June 6th. What he found was already a catastrophe. Rouge recorded that Rommel was visibly shaken by the reports coming in from the coast. The Field Marshal had staked everything on defeating the invasion at the waterline within the first hours, before the Allies could establish a foothold. He had argued bitterly with General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt, the overall commander in the west, over the placement of panzer reserves. Rommel wanted them close to the beaches. Rundstedt wanted them held back for a concentrated counterattack. Hitler had compromised by giving neither commander full control, splitting the armoured reserves in a way that satisfied no one. Now, with the Allies ashore and expanding their beachhead, the panzer divisions that might have made a difference were caught in a nightmare of their own. They could not move. This was the first lesson that began to break Rommel's confidence. Allied air supremacy was not merely an advantage, it was a new kind of warfare. The 21st Panzer Division, the only armoured unit close enough to counterattack on D-Day, attempted to reach the coast and was savaged from the air. Tank columns that tried to move on roads in daylight were spotted within minutes by Allied fighter bombers and attacked relentlessly. The division's war diary recorded losing vehicles in numbers that shocked its commanders, not to enemy tanks, but to aircraft they could not see until the bombs were already falling. Rommel had experienced Allied air power in North Africa, where British and American fighters had made movement increasingly dangerous in the final months of the campaign. But what he witnessed in Normandy was of an entirely different magnitude. In North Africa, the Luftwaffe had still been present, still capable of occasional local air superiority, still able to provide some cover for ground operations. In Normandy, the Luftwaffe had effectively ceased to exist as a factor in the battle. German records from the first week of the invasion show fewer than 100 Luftwaffe sorties on many days against Allied totals that sometimes exceeded 10,000. Rommel was not merely outnumbered in the air, he was fighting without an air force at all. The consequences cascaded through every level of German operations. Reinforcements ordered to Normandy from across France arrived late, depleted, and disorganized. The 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, received orders to move from southern France to the invasion front and took over 2 weeks to cover a distance that should have required 3 days. American and British fighter bombers turned every road march into a gauntlet. Trains were attacked, bridges were destroyed, fuel depots were hit before their contents could be distributed. German commanders, who had spent years on the Eastern Front, where the Luftwaffe still provided at least partial support, were stunned by the totality of Allied air dominance in France. General Major Fritz Bayerlein, who commanded the elite Panzer Lehr Division and had served as Rommel's Chief of Staff in Africa, described the approach march to Normandy as a continuous catastrophe. His division lost 84 half-tracks, over 40 fuel trucks, and 5 tanks before it even reached the front, all to air attack. At La Roche-Guyon, Rommel absorbed these reports with a growing despair that those around him could see plainly. Rouge's diary entries from mid-June describe a commander whose famous optimism and aggression were draining away day by day. Rommel began making statements that would have been unthinkable even weeks earlier. He told Rouge that the war was lost. He said it quietly at first, in the privacy of their evening walks along the chateau's gardens, where they could speak without being overheard by staff officers whose loyalty to the regime might outweigh their loyalty to their commander. But the conviction hardened quickly. By late June, Rommel was saying it openly to his inner circle. Speidel noted that Rommel began to speak not merely of the military situation, but of the political one, questioning the leadership in Berlin, questioning the decisions that had brought Germany to this point, questioning whether the sacrifices being demanded of his soldiers had any purpose at all. The American military machine provided the evidence for these conclusions daily. Even as Rommel's despair deepened, the Allied build-up on the beaches accelerated at a rate that mocked every German assumption about logistics. The artificial Mulberry harbours, prefabricated in Britain and towed across the English Channel, allowed the Allies to unload supplies directly onto the invasion coast without needing to capture a major port. German naval intelligence had considered such a thing theoretically possible but practically absurd. Yet there they were, functioning harbours assembled from concrete caissons and floating roadways, handling thousands of tons of cargo per day. When a severe storm destroyed the American Mulberry at Omaha Beach on June 19th, the blow seemed significant. But the Americans simply increased unloading operations directly over the beaches, using landing craft and DUKWs to maintain supply flow at levels that still exceeded what Germany could deliver to its own forces in Normandy by road and rail under constant air attack. By the end of June, the Allies had landed over 850,000 troops, 148,000 vehicles, and 570,000 tons of supplies. These numbers reached Rommel's headquarters in intelligence summaries that Speidel described as reading like a catalogue of impossibilities. The fall of Cherbourg on June 26th added another blow. Rommel had understood that holding the deep-water port was essential to slowing the Allied build-up. The garrison fought stubbornly, but the American 7th Corps under Major General J. Lawton Collins invested the city with a methodical efficiency that overwhelmed the defenders in a matter of days. American artillery pounded the fortifications while infantry systematically cleared the city block by block. The port facilities had been extensively demolished by the German garrison before surrender, but American engineers, working with a speed that astonished German prisoners who watched the reconstruction, had the port partially operational within weeks. The ability to repair, rebuild and improvise at this pace was something German officers encountered repeatedly and never fully understood. It was not merely that the Americans had more equipment, they had a philosophy of engineering and logistics that treated every problem as solvable and every timeline as compressible. In the Bocage country south of the invasion beaches, the fighting settled into a grinding attrition battle through hedgerow country that seemed to favour the defenders. German soldiers, fighting from the ancient earthen embankments of Norman farm fields, inflicted serious casualties on the advancing Americans. Individual hedgerow positions could hold for hours, even days, against infantry attacks. German machine gunners and mortar teams used the terrain with skill, and American units paid heavily for every field they crossed. But the arithmetic of attrition told a story that terrified German commanders who understood logistics. American divisions that took heavy casualties received replacements. German divisions did not. An American infantry regiment that lost 300 men in a week of hedgerow fighting could expect fresh troops within days, often accompanied by replacement vehicles, ammunition, and equipment in quantities that German officers found bewildering. A German regiment that lost the same number simply became weaker. There was no reserve of trained replacements. There were no fresh divisions waiting behind the lines. Every man lost was irreplaceable. Rommel understood this calculus with painful clarity. He had seen it before, in the final weeks in Tunisia, when his Africa Corps had simply run out of everything, while the Americans and British poured in reinforcements from an apparently inexhaustible supply. The British launched Operation Epsom on June 26th, a major offensive aimed at encircling Caen from the west. The attack drew in German panzer reserves that had been desperately needed elsewhere, and while it did not achieve its territorial objectives, it imposed a rate of attrition on German armoured forces that Rommel recognised as catastrophic. The The 2nd SS Panzer Corps, which had been held in reserve for a decisive counterattack, was committed piecemeal to defensive fighting and ground down. Rommel had hoped to mass his armour for a single powerful blow that would drive the Allies back toward the sea. Instead, his panzer divisions were being consumed in a defensive battle of attrition that favoured the side with the deeper reserves. Every week, the Allies landed fresh divisions. Every week, German strength diminished. Rommel watched these numbers and understood where the lines on the graph would cross. The material disparity was not limited to manpower. American artillery in Normandy operated with an efficiency and volume that German officers consistently described as their single greatest source of fear. The American system of fire direction, which could coordinate the guns of multiple batteries onto a single target within minutes using the fire direction center method, had no equivalent in the German army. A forward observer spotting a target could radio back to a fire direction center, which would calculate firing data and transmit it to every battery within range simultaneously. The result was that shells from dozens of guns could converge on a single point within minutes of the target being identified. German artillery doctrine relied on pre-planned fires and centralized control that was slower and less flexible. When German gun positions fired, American counter-battery radar could locate them almost immediately, and return fire would arrive before German crews could displace. The practical result was that American infantry could call down devastating concentrations of fire on German positions with a speed that seemed impossible, while German artillery operated under constant threat of destruction the moment it revealed itself. Post-war interrogations of German officers captured in Normandy reveal a consistent theme. The tanks were dangerous, the infantry was determined, but the artillery was what broke them. An officer from the 352nd Infantry Division, which had fought at Omaha Beach and in the Bocage beyond, told his interrogators that his men could endure almost anything except the American artillery, because it came without warning, in enormous volume, with terrifying accuracy. Another captured officer, from a Panzer Grenadier unit that had fought in the hedgerows south of Carentan, described calling for his own artillery support and waiting 40 minutes for a response, while American guns could deliver fire on his position within 5 minutes of being spotted. The imbalance was not merely numerical, it was systemic. American artillery reflected an entire philosophy of combined arms warfare that the German army, for all its tactical excellence, had never matched. Against this backdrop, the conspiracy that had been growing quietly within the German officer corps found fertile ground at La Roche-Guyon. The seeds had been planted months earlier. In February of 1944, before the invasion, Karl Strolin, the mayor of Stuttgart, and an old friend of Rommel from their shared youth in Württemberg, had visited the Field Marshal and spoken frankly about the need to end the war. Strolin was connected to the civilian wing of the resistance, and he later testified that he had raised with Rommel the possibility that military leaders would need to act if Hitler refused to seek peace. Rommel had listened without committing himself, but he had not dismissed the conversation or reported it. The fact that he allowed such a discussion to occur at all was significant. In the Third Reich, merely hearing such talk without informing the authorities was an act of treason. Speidel was the key operational link. Through his pre-war academic connections and his friendship with Stülpnagel, he was in contact with the wider circle of military officers and civilians who had been plotting against Hitler since at least 1938. The group in Paris was particularly active. Stülpnagel, as military governor, had both the authority and the personal conviction to act. He had long despised the regime, not merely for its military incompetence, but for its crimes, which he had witnessed firsthand in the East before his transfer to France. His cousin, Oberstleutnant Caesar von Hofacker, served as the crucial liaison between the Paris conspirators and the central group in Berlin, led by Oberst Klaus von Stauffenberg. Hofacker was a man of extraordinary passion and moral conviction, a decorated officer who had concluded that loyalty to Germany demanded disloyalty to its leader. Hofacker visited La Roche-Guyon multiple times in June and July of 1944, and Speidel later described these visits as pivotal. Hofacker came not as an abstract political theorist, but as a frontline witness. He had visited forward positions. He had seen the wreckage of German columns destroyed by Allied air attacks. He had spoken to divisional commanders who described their situation as hopeless. He brought this first-hand knowledge to his conversations at the chateau, and his arguments carried the weight of immediate, observable reality. The war in Normandy was not a distant strategic abstraction for these men. It was happening outside their windows. The sound of Allied naval guns was audible at La Roche-Guyon on clear days. The bomber formations passed overhead with metronomic regularity. Every morning brought reports of further losses that could not be replaced. On June 29th, Rommel travelled to the Berghof, Hitler's mountain retreat in Bavaria, for a meeting that Rüge and Speidel both documented as a turning point. Rommel had requested the meeting to present the military situation directly to Hitler, without the filtering and optimism that characterized reports as they passed through the chain of command. Rundstedt accompanied him. The two field marshals laid out the facts as plainly as they could. The Allied build-up was overwhelming. German losses could not be replaced. Air superiority had made normal military operations impossible. Rommel, according to multiple post-war accounts, attempted to raise the broader political implications. He wanted to discuss what would happen when the front in Normandy collapsed, as he now believed it inevitably would. Hitler cut him off. The Führer launched into a monologue about wonder weapons, about the coming deployment of jet aircraft and long-range rockets that would reverse the course of the war. He refused to discuss retreat, reinforcement priorities, or any scenario that did not end in German victory. Rommel left the Berghof in a state of cold fury that Rüge recorded in detail. The meeting had confirmed what Rommel already suspected. The man directing the war had no connection to the reality of the war being fought. The exact nature and extent of Rommel's involvement in the conspiracy remains one of the most debated questions in the history of the Second World War. What the evidence supports is this. Rommel knew that officers around him were in contact with the resistance. He did not report them. He shared their assessment that the war was lost and that the current leadership was incapable of ending it. He favoured an approach to the Western Allies for an armistice, possibly involving the opening of the front, to allow American and British forces to advance into Germany before the Soviets could, a plan that revealed both desperation and a fundamental misunderstanding of Allied unity. What Rommel apparently did not support was assassination. Speidel and others who survived the war consistently stated that Rommel believed killing Hitler would make him a martyr, that it was better to arrest him and put him on trial before the German people. Whether this distinction was genuine or a post-war construction designed to protect Rommel's reputation is impossible to know with certainty. What is certain is the event that brought the crisis to a head. On July 15, 1944, Rommel sent a report to the German High Command that was remarkable for its bluntness. Addressed to Hitler through the chain of command, the report laid out the military situation in Normandy in terms that left no room for the optimistic interpretations Berlin preferred. Since the invasion, Rommel wrote, the German army in the West had lost 97,000 men, including over 2,800 officers, and had received only 6,000 replacements. 225 tanks had been destroyed, and only 17 replaced. The enemy, by contrast, grew stronger daily. Rommel described the American and British build-up as proceeding without significant interference, their supplies flowing ashore in quantities that Germany could not match, their air forces operating without opposition. The report concluded with a statement that was as close to an ultimatum as a field marshal could deliver to his supreme commander. The troops were fighting heroically, Rommel wrote, but the unequal struggle was heading for its end. He asked the Führer to draw the political conclusions. Draw the political conclusions. Speidel, who helped draft the report, understood exactly what Rommel meant. So did everyone at La Roche-Guyon. The field marshal was telling Hitler to seek peace. The report was transmitted through channels, and there is no evidence that Hitler ever responded to it directly. But its language was unmistakable, and it would later be used as evidence of Rommel's disaffection when the Gestapo came looking for connections to the conspiracy. 2 days later, on July 17th, Rommel's staff car was attacked by Allied fighter bombers on a road near the village of Sainte-Foy de Montgomery. The field marshal was returning from a visit to the headquarters of the 1st SS Panzer Corps when the aircraft were spotted. His driver, Unteroffizier Daniel, attempted evasive action, but the road offered no cover. The aircraft, most likely Canadian Spitfires or possibly Royal Air Force Typhoons, strafed the car at low altitude. Daniel was hit in the shoulder and lost control. The car struck a tree stump, threw Rommel from the vehicle, and crashed into a ditch. Rommel suffered severe skull fractures, brain contusions, and injuries to his left eye and cheekbone. He was unconscious when pulled from the road. He was rushed to a Luftwaffe hospital and then to a civilian facility, where surgeons worked to save his life. He would survive, but his active command was finished. The man who might have played a central role in whatever came next had been removed from the stage by the very air power that had convinced him the war was lost. It was, in its way, a perfect symbol of what the Allied air campaign had accomplished. It did not merely destroy tanks and trucks and supply depots, it destroyed the will and the capacity of German commanders to function. General Feldmarschall Günther von Kluge replaced Rommel as commander of Army Group B. Kluge arrived in Normandy on July 17th with instructions from Hitler to stabilize the front and with a personal disposition to distrust Rommel's pessimism. He had been on the Eastern Front and believed that Western Front commanders had grown soft. This confidence lasted approximately 48 hours. After visiting the front and seeing the conditions for himself, after watching Allied aircraft operate with complete impunity over the battlefield, after reading the casualty reports and the supply requisitions that could never be filled, Kluge began sending reports to Berlin that echoed everything Rommel had said. Within a week, Kluge was telling his staff that the situation was hopeless. The pattern repeated itself with mechanical precision. Every German commander who arrived in Normandy with optimism left it in despair, and the cause was always the same. The weight of American and Allied material power was simply beyond anything the German military system could sustain. 3 days later, on July 20th, 1944, Stauffenberg carried a briefcase containing a bomb into the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's headquarters, in East Prussia. The explosion tore apart the conference room, but failed to kill the Führer. A heavy oak table leg had deflected the blast. Hitler survived with minor injuries. Within hours, the conspiracy began to unravel. In Berlin, the plotters hesitated fatally, uncertain whether Hitler was dead. By evening, loyal officers had seized control of the War Ministry, and the round of arrests began that would eventually sweep up thousands. In Paris, Stülpnagel acted with the decisiveness that the Berlin plotters lacked. On the evening of July 20th, believing initially that Hitler was dead, he ordered the arrest of all SS and Gestapo personnel in the city. Over 1,200 men were taken into custody by Wehrmacht soldiers in a swift, professionally executed operation that demonstrated exactly how effective the plot could have been if it had been carried out with the same efficiency everywhere. For a few hours that night, Paris was in the hands of the conspirators. Then the word came through that Hitler had survived. Stülpnagel's position became impossible. He was summoned to Berlin. On the drive back, near Verdun, he attempted to take his own life with a pistol. The bullet blinded him, but did not kill him. He was dragged before the People's Court, unable to see his accusers, and hanged on August 30th, 1944. Hofacker was arrested and subjected to prolonged and savage interrogation by the Gestapo. Under torture, he revealed names, including connections that led investigators toward Rommel. How much Hofacker said, and how accurately it was recorded by his interrogators, is uncertain. The Gestapo was not an organization known for precise transcription, but the thread was enough. By September, Hitler's suspicion had settled on Rommel, and the machinery of retribution began to turn. Rommel, still recovering from his injuries at his home in Herrlingen, received visits from fellow officers who warned him that his name had come up in the investigations. Speidel had been arrested on September 7th and held for interrogation, though he managed to avoid implicating Rommel directly and, remarkably, survived the war. But the net was closing. On October 14th, 1944, 2 generals arrived at Rommel's home with a message from Hitler. The Field Marshal was given a choice. He could face the People's Court, where conviction and execution were certain, and where his family would suffer the consequences of his disgrace. Or he could take the cyanide capsule they had brought with them, and the official story would be that he had died of his wounds from the July strafing attack. His family would receive a state funeral, a pension, and protection. Rommel chose the poison. He said goodbye to his wife and his son Manfred, walked to the waiting car, and was dead within minutes. The state funeral was held with full military honors. Hitler sent a wreath, The official cause of death was reported as complications from his injuries. The truth would not emerge publicly until after the war. The destruction of Rommel's circle was part of a wider catastrophe that consumed the German resistance. The Gestapo's investigation expanded in waves through the late summer and autumn of 1944. An estimated 7,000 people were arrested. Nearly 5,000 were executed, many after trials before the People's Court presided over by the fanatical Roland Freisler, who screamed abuse at the defendants and denied them any semblance of legal process. The conspirators were hanged with piano wire, and Hitler ordered that the executions be filmed for his private viewing. The military leadership that might have shortened the war by months, that might have spared hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides, was methodically destroyed. And the American military machine that had set this chain of events in motion continued to build in strength. On July 25th, 5 days after the failed assassination attempt, Operation Cobra launched the breakout from the Normandy hedgerows. Over 1,500 American heavy bombers dropped their payloads on a narrow stretch of German line near Saint-Lô, obliterating the Panzer Division in a bombardment that Bayerlein described as turning the landscape into a moonscape. The earth itself seemed to liquefy. Tanks were flipped and buried. Entire defensive positions vanished. Bayerlein himself survived only because he had positioned his command post in a location that was just outside the kill zone. His division, one of the finest armoured formations Germany possessed, effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force in a single afternoon. Of the roughly 330 tanks and assault guns Panzer had brought to Normandy, only a handful remained operational after the carpet bombing. The breakout that followed sent American armoured columns under Patton racing across France at a pace that the German command could neither match nor contain. Towns and cities fell so quickly that German headquarters maps became obsolete before they could be updated. By August, the German army in France was in full retreat. The Falaise pocket trapped tens of thousands of German soldiers in a shrinking perimeter where they were subjected to relentless for every tank lost, and the other side could not. They reached a conclusion that was not emotional but mathematical. The war could not be won, and for some of them, that conclusion led to actions that cost them everything. Rommel remains the most famous figure connected to the plot, though his exact role continues to be debated by historians. What is not debated is what drove him to it. He told Ruge. He told Speidel. He wrote it in his reports. He watched it from the windows of La Roche-Guyon every day. The formations in the sky, the unending ships offshore, the shells that arrived in volumes his own artillery could never match, the replacements that appeared as if conjured from nothing. American military power did not merely defeat Rommel's army in the field, it defeated his belief that the war had any future worth fighting for. Speidel survived. He was held by the Gestapo but never tried, partly through luck, partly through the protection of fellow officers who managed to keep his case from reaching the People's Court, and partly because an army court of honor chaired by Guderian and Rundstedt declined to expel him from the army, which would have sent him to Freisler's jurisdiction. It was a narrow escape. After the war, Speidel served in the new West German army and rose to command NATO ground forces in Central Europe, serving alongside the Americans and British whose military power had once shattered everything he defended. The irony was not lost on him. Rouge survived as well, and his diary remains one of the most detailed and valuable records of Rommel's final months in command. A day-by-day account of a commander watching the reality of modern industrial warfare overwhelm the army he had spent his life serving. Ruge, too, served in the post-war German Navy, contributing to the integration of the new Bundeswehr into the Western alliance that Rommel had once fought against, and that the conspirators had hoped to approach for peace. Stulpnagel and Hofacker did not survive. Their names are remembered among the thousands who paid the ultimate price for opposing the regime from within. Their courage was real, so was their miscalculation. They had hoped that removing Hitler would allow a negotiated end to the war. What they perhaps did not fully understand was that the Allies had already decided on unconditional surrender, that no deal would be struck with any German government, military or civilian. The war would end only one way, but the impulse that drove them, the recognition that the American war machine had made German defeat inevitable, and that continued fighting meant only pointless slaughter, was not wrong. It was, in fact, exactly right. The skies over Normandy in the summer of 1944 contained the answer to the question that consumed Rommel's final months of command. Every bomber formation, every fighter sweep, every naval shell that crashed into the bluffs, every replacement division that appeared on the beach, every truck that rolled supplies forward on roads that less air and artillery attack. Eisenhower's aide later described the scene inside the pocket as one of the greatest killing grounds of the war. German soldiers who escaped described roads choked with burning vehicles, dead horses, and the bodies of their comrades, all under a sky that belonged entirely to the enemy. The 7th German Army and the 5th Panzer Army were effectively destroyed as fighting formations. Over 50,000 German soldiers were captured. Tens of thousands more were killed. Equipment losses were so severe that the surviving units were little more than remnants straggling eastward with whatever they could carry. Klug, who had replaced Rommel and then experienced the same shattering realization about Allied power, was himself drawn into the web of suspicion. He had known about the conspiracy before arriving in Normandy. His own chief of staff on the Eastern Front had been among the plotters. After the failure of the July 20th attempt, Kluge found himself under increasing scrutiny from Berlin. On August 15th, he was contacted by the conspirators' remnants about the possibility of surrendering his forces in the West, but events overtook any such plan. On August 18th, Hitler relieved him of command. On the drive back to Germany, near Metz, Kluge wrote a final letter to Hitler in which he acknowledged the hopelessness of the military situation and urged the Führer to end the war. Then he took a cyanide capsule. Another German field marshal, destroyed by the collision between reality in the field and delusion in Berlin. The pattern that had consumed Rommel was consuming the entire command structure of the Western Front. Rommel had seen it coming. Rouge had recorded it. Speidel had understood it. Hofacker and Stulpnagel had tried to act on it. The overwhelming reality of American and Allied military power in Normandy had driven these men to the conclusion that their country's leadership was marching them toward annihilation. They were right. The tragedy of the July 20th plot was not merely that it failed. It was that the conditions which made it necessary, the total dominance of Allied air power, the bottomless American supply of men and machines, the industrial capacity that could replace in a week what Germany could not replace in a month, these conditions only intensified after the conspiracy was crushed. The men who might have ended the war in the summer of 1944 were dead or imprisoned, and the war ground on for another 10 months, consuming millions more lives. The officers of Rommel's inner circle had spent their careers in the most professional and technically accomplished military institution in the world. They had conquered France in 6 weeks, driven the British from mainland Europe, and pushed deep into the Soviet Union. They were not men given to panic or defeatism. When they looked at the skies over Normandy and saw nothing but Allied aircraft, when they read the reports of American divisions being replaced faster than they could be damaged, when they calculated the mathematics of a war in which one side could produce a new tank Luftwaffe could not touch, all of it added up to a single, inescapable truth. The war was over. Rommel knew it. His officers knew it. The conspiracy they joined or supported or tolerated was their response to that knowledge. It failed. And the price of its failure was paid not only by the conspirators themselves, but by every soldier and civilian who died in the 10 months between July 1944 and May 1945. Months in which the war continued, because the men who tried to stop it were hanging from piano wire in Plötzensee prison. These stories cost something to live through. The least we can do is remember them. If this one meant something to you, subscribe so you do not miss the next. A like helps more people find these videos, and the comments here have become something special. Veterans' descendants sharing what their families never talked about. Be part of that. I will see you next time.